Okay, well, nice to see folks in person and welcome to folks on Zoom. My name is Anthony Ong, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Eileen Graham, who will be our featured speaker today as part of the fall seminar series that's being sponsored by the Center for Integrative Developmental Science. Dr. Graham is an associate professor in the Department of Medical Social Sciences at Northwestern. She received her PhD in psychology at Brandeis and then went on to do a postdoc at Northwestern, where she's remained on the faculty. Her research focuses on personality and how personality, broadly defined, influences health in older adults. I would say that one of the things that I think distinguishes her work in this area is her commitment to open science practices. And I've been struck by how this has been such a core principle in her research, and how that's had an impact, a positive impact on her research collaborations. I know I've learned a lot. Her commitment to reproducible findings is also reflected in her integrative data analysis methods, which you'll hear more about today. So I was really delighted when she accepted the invitation to come in person and share with us her insights. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eileen Graham.
Thank you very much for having me today. I'm really excited to present some of my work with you all. Did a really good job of blocking this out, and just in this moment I got nervous, so pardon my flutter of nerves in this particular moment. So yes, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. I really just appreciate all of your presence here and just interest in hearing about the work that we're doing with my group. So yes, like Anthony said, I am on the faculty at the Department of Medical Social Sciences at Northwestern University. It is a part of the medical school, not in the psych department, but there are many of us psychologists on the faculty there. So we kind of weave our line of thinking into a lot of the medical research that's being done. So it's a really exciting place to work. We're always hiring. So if you're looking for a postdoc or research faculty job, come talk to me. There are very, very many openings at any given time. So would love to chat with you about that. And I'm personally hiring right now. So broadly speaking, I'll be discussing psychosocial factors in health in older adulthood. One emphasis that I have is on cognitive health in particular. Like Anthony said, I'm a developmental psychologist by training. My interests are anchored around how personality traits or other individual difference factors are related to cognitive aging processes in particular, but we also look at health more broadly. So in recent years, I've broadened that to be more a wider variety of health outcomes in old age, as well as other psychosocial factors such as loneliness and social isolation, those sorts of things. So today I'll kind of be walking you through a lot of my substantive work and kind of two key lines of research that I have. And I'll also be kind of couching this all within a discussion of my methodological practices, which Anthony also already mentioned, my open science principles, and how my approaches, I hope, have helped advance the field of the lifespan psychological sciences. And before I continue, I'd like to do my acknowledgements beforehand because people always run out of time and rush through them. But the fact of the matter is that my work would not get done without having large teams doing many components all at different times. So I work with undergraduates, grad students, postdocs, junior faculty. I work with international teams to help pull together data sets from sites that can't share their data. And that's part of why I love doing what I do, is that it's trying to make this sort of approach more inclusive to all the different methods of collecting data around the world. So this is our most recent team here at Northwestern. Some of these individuals are alumni, but every single person here has been truly instrumental in getting this work done. And you'll see their names pop up as the lead authors on many of these projects. Then I also have to thank my funding, just in case there's a PO around, sniffing around. And also the pictures that I use are primarily from these two websites. Okay, so I'll start out by providing an overview of just my big picture interests, including an overarching theoretical model that informs much of what I do. And then before I jump into kind of the meat of my substantive work, I'll spend a few minutes discussing those methodological principles that we've touched upon here. So then I'll jump into my two main areas of research. So first off, the big picture. The bulk of my substantive work fits into this theoretical model. So broadly speaking, I'm interested in the interplay between psychosocial factors in earlier adulthood, health behavior, lifestyle factors in middle adulthood, and then various downstream health outcomes in older adulthood. So how do these things work together to impact health processes as people get older, with kind of a overarching goal of understanding how we can optimize the health span, in particular the cognitive health span. So on the left, the key psychosocial factors that I focus on are personality traits, mostly the big five, but it's a little bit more broad than that, and the experience of loneliness and social isolation. In the middle here, my work examines various lifestyle factors, health behaviors, such as physical activity, smoking, drinking behavior, healthcare utilization. And then on the right, I focus on outcomes such as chronic conditions, for example, hypertension, heart disease, odds of developing dementia or diabetes and dementia, cognitive function, and mortality. So the work that I'll be discussing today falls along one of these three pathways. So we first have a large portion of my work, or looking at some of it falls, the pathways linking psychosocial factors just to these lifestyle factors. So does personality predict healthcare utilization? Does it predict smoking behavior? A large bit of my work is this C pathway, if you've ever heard of mediation, looks at the direct pathways from psychological factors into health and old age. And then a smaller but still notable piece is looking at the pathways linking lifestyle to health, which is just an important pathway to consider, especially if we're looking at these, you guessed it, mediation models. Only a small portion of my work has explicitly looked at full mediation within the context of my methodological practices. And as we get into some of my work, you'll see why it's actually really hard to do. So it's easier said than done within this methodological framework. So I've kind of teased the waters here. So before we get into all those substantive pieces, let's talk methods. So many scientific fields in recent years have been undergoing a recent overhaul in their scientific practices to increase replicability and credibility of their published findings. Much of this work focuses on bringing practices to aging research. That's what I do. Where we have a slightly added difficulty of relying on existing data to answer our research questions. For example, some of the questions that we're asking rely on large, long-term longitudinal panel studies. So these studies are generally very well powered and able to test very sophisticated models. But then there's a problem when those models being tested are so specifically tailored to that data set. So for example, you're constraining your specific SEM parameters to achieve your optimal model fit, that you run the risk of overfitting your model. And that model then runs a very low chance of replicating or generalizing to other data sets. So what information are we really gathering? So much like this mattress is only going to be a good fit for like one person, that particular model might only be a good fit for one, maybe one other data set. But what does that say about generalizability? So additionally, incentive structures in academia and the general culture around academic publishing has resulted in a tendency of bias towards one's particular pet theory, framework, or hypothesis. And this past decade or so of the we don't call it the replication crisis anymore, we call it the credibility revolution. There's been a clear call for a larger toolbox of resources that are put into action to help lower those incentives towards questionable research practices that many of us might have been using without even realizing it, like p-hacking is the big one, especially in like the large longitudinal data sets. So we want to approach our work not like sports fans, but actual scientists. So that's why I have this little picture of the scientist dragging the sports fan up the hill here. Yeah. So listed here are 3 of the many tools that are becoming more common practice, and they're all aimed at adding transparency and credibility to our research processes. So the first 2 I have listed here are starting to be adopted more commonly by psych journals. And I've published 2 recent papers demonstrating the utility first of pre-registration, and then secondly, on registered reports of secondary data analysis. And these two approaches are still very highly criticized because technically we have access to the data. The data exists. Many of our co-authors technically know things about the data. So we're trying to figure out ways that we can use these tools and still have a layer of transparency around, yes, technically we do have access to information about inferential information in these data sets, but we're not looking at it as we're developing our analysis plan. We're disclosing what's known prior to running our analyses. And it seems to, with, you know, some pushback, which is good. You want to have a little bit of push and pull. They're starting to be more widely adopted. So the approach that I primarily, so we use pre-registration and registered reports in the work that I do, but the big thing that I do is called integrative data analysis. And this is an umbrella term used to describe pretty much any methodological attempt to synthesize the answers to a set of research questions across more than one data source. This tool can be particularly useful when there exist many sources of data that can answer a set of research questions. So IDA can be more or less broken down into two main types. So first we have pooled analysis, which is where you combine the data sets into a single mega data set. You run a single set of models and get a single set of answers. This requires some wizardry. Some might call it real harmonization. I think Pat Curran recently put out a paper talking about logical versus analytic harmonization, where you really need to use like psychometric properties, that sort of thing, in order to really establish that the various tools across the data sets are from a measurement standpoint identical before you run those models or before you combine them into a single data set. This can be super powerful. It also limits your the data sets that you can use to a relatively small number, so that can be perfectly harmonized or close to perfectly harmonized. But what do you do when there are actually quite a few data sets? If you kind of stand back from it and look at, okay, there technically are a lot of data sets that could answer that question, but the designs are different. The measurement tools are a little bit different. Can we still ask the question in all the data sets and come up with a common set of answers and look at how well each one answers that question? So that's where coordinated analysis has come in really handy for us. So in coordinated analysis, data sets are kept separate. Those design and measurement differences are allowed to vary, and variables are then harmonized more conceptually, or what Curran et al. Calls logical harmonization. So it's more of a conceptual harmonization, but then they're transformed identically. So the estimates are interpreted in the same way. So like, for example, everything's z-scored or com-scored. So then you're interpreting those estimates along in the same units. So then there may be differences in the way the construct was measured, but then the interpretation of the estimates in a model will be directly comparable. So then you can use the tools of meta-analysis, say, in order to come up with like a synthesized answer, if that's what you want. So we're holding as many things as we can constant at the transformation and modeling level. And then we run an identical or close to identical as possible set of models on each data set separately. And then we summarize them, sometimes using the tools of meta-analysis, but sometimes you can't, depending on how many data sets you have. And there are rules around like power when you do meta-analysis. I think there's one rule of thumb that you need actually 20 data sets to really have a reliable meta-analytic estimate. And then when we try to get under within that, if we see, so we can look at the spread of effects across, like in a forest plot. And if you have wide heterogeneity, then you can drill down and see at the study level, if study level differences can account for that. And that's using a tool called meta-regression. So like adding moderators to your random effects meta-analysis. And that can ascertain the extent to which whether differences in the estimate can be accounted for by individual study estimates. For example, what year the data set was collected in, or whether it was using the NEO or the IPIP or the BFI. What's another example? Oh, what continent the data originated in? Are they European studies versus US studies? But that gets tricky when, say, you only have 10 studies and then your K-level power is low. So we kind of approach that cautiously, but that tool is at our disposal. And then we can actually use those measurement differences as a liability, not an asset, or I mean, I said that backwards. As an asset, not a liability. Haha, we're recording, aren't we? Because then consistent results can then point to a generalizability and how well that effect is actually being replicated across the studies in spite of the spread of measurement and design differences. So it actually, I feel like it advances the field a little more quickly. So as you may have guessed, coordinated analysis is my preferred approach. And over the years, I have developed and fine-tuned this method for our purposes within the lifespan psychological sciences. And you'll see findings using CDA sprinkled throughout. I think I took out all of my single study findings here just so I could be highlighting CDAs. So I got my start working with the IALSA, the Integrative Analysis of Longitudinal Studies of Aging and Dementia, which was originally a PO1 that was funded, I think it started 10 years ago now. So I got my start doing my postdoc back in 2013 with Dan Rozek at Northwestern. And this grant had just started. And if you've ever met Dan, he's like larger than life. Like, you'll never guess what we're going to do. We're going to be able to replicate these long-term findings. We don't have to wait 50 years for another sample to die. We can do it all at once. But we have to figure out how to do it. So he and I figured out how to do it using guidance from Scott Hofer, Andrea Pachinin, Graciela Muniz-Torreira, which were some of the PIs and really kind of some of the pioneers in this area. So I really have them to thank for giving me the resources and tools and guidance as we kind of moved forward doing this. So over these years, I've been fine-tuning this method, and it's been very exciting. This is kind of just what I do now. And so in addition to my empirical work, actually asking substantive questions using coordinated analysis, I've also put out a few methodological or conceptual pieces that have provided guidance and insight to anybody seeking to adopt this method for their own work. So this is me evangelizing to all of you. So these papers show, among other things, if I can click slides, there we go. First, just how to do coordinated analysis, some basics on the steps of how to go about it. Considerations for pre-registering a coordinated analysis. So what you might find if you guys use the Open Science Framework, there is a template for pre-registering secondary data analysis, and this paper has created a template for, it's basically like a supplement to those secondary analysis and pre-registration templates for additional questions that you might ask if you're pre-registering a coordinated analysis, just to add an extra layer there. And then lastly, how this approach can help address issues such as data overuse, data overfitting in aging research. So if you're interested, you may check out those papers. So in 2018, I organized and led a 2-day workshop trying to answer a key foundational question in lifespan psychological sciences, particularly personality psychology. So we wanted to teach early career researchers how to do coordinated analysis and then answer a really big question. So basically, there is a lot of existing evidence that being high in conscientiousness is good for your health, and that being high in neuroticism is bad for your health. But what about this idea of healthy neuroticism? If somebody's both high in C and high in N, which one wins out? So this running hypothesis was put forth by Howard Freeman over a decade ago, probably a decade and a half at this point, and is essentially arguing that the salubrious effects of conscientiousness combined with the high vigilance of neuroticism might result in a net positive effect. And this, if you look back at a decade plus of research since Howard Freeman put forth this idea, you will see, and I wish I had more citations here, but like you really have to go looking for them. You'll see a C by N interaction slipped into the analyses in various papers, like their personality and health papers, and it's like, and then we tested C by N and look, it worked, or no, it didn't. Sometimes it's subject to the file drawer, but there was this big like face validity problem facing the field where everybody thinks this sounds really great, it should be a thing, but it's not being tested systematically. So sometimes you'll see papers that have looked at it, sometimes you'll see a paper focusing on something else that like slipped in that interaction, and you kind of have to go digging for it. And so my team, we just kind of come in with a sledgehammer and we're like, let's just answer it, let's just see. So this project sought to test basically a moderation approach. So if we do the C by N interaction predicting various health outcomes, what do we find? So we identified basically across, I don't have the mediation model set up there, but basically looking at all three pathways of that theoretical model. So does the C by N interaction predict health behaviors? Does it predict mortality? Does it predict health? So we looked at odds of smoking, drinking, physical activity, odds of developing chronic conditions, specifically heart disease, diabetes, and hypertension. And then does it predict mortality? So we had 3 sets of models. 2 of them were just logistic regressions. 1 of them was Cox survival models. So we wanted to test all 3 pathways in a single coordinated analysis project. So in order to meet inclusion criteria, a given data set needed to have at least 1 baseline measurement of any Big 5 personality inventory, as long as it measured conscientiousness and neuroticism. So like the Ising studies were kicked out. Plus our key health behaviors. And we picked those 3 specifically because large longitudinal panel studies typically ask about whether or not a participant has ever been diagnosed with those 3 things, because they're pretty common in older adulthood. And then we knew we'd also have the power to predict logistically those things in all studies. And then most large panel studies also gather mortality info. But even just one of those 3 outcomes would have qualified it, and then they would have just been in that subset of models. So we planned the analyses, identified data sets that could answer the question, and then invited people to participate. So we reached out to the PIs of each study and asked them to nominate an early career researcher to come in and participate in person in January 2018 in Chicago. So it was freezing cold, and we all hunkered down in this conference room. So all we asked was that they come to the site with a data set on their laptop, so they didn't have to share it directly with us. And they needed to have these variables in a data set, basically more or less wrangled, and then we like confirm all the transformations that everything was harmonized when we got there. So the first goal was to give everyone a tutorial on how to do coordinated analysis. And then we proceeded to jointly like clean or confirm the cleaning and analyzing of the data over the next day and a half. And then towards the end of the workshop, all the analysts uploaded their output files onto the OSF, and then we downloaded them onto a single laptop. And then Sarah Weston, who was our postdoc at the time, she had all the meta-analysis scripts written. So these plots that you see, we also had some forest plots, all came together in real time. And we were like, boom, here's what the effect is. Here's what the meta-analysis is. So we got to see the end result come together in real time, which was super cool. And then we spent the rest of the time like discussing and interpreting and talking about next steps. And in the end, we published a 3-paper series on this. It all came out in 2020 while we were all hunkered down in isolation. Notably, 2 of these 3 papers had null findings, and I see a couple of you like looking at that figure, trying to look at it. This is a null effect. There's nothing to see here. So we found that healthy neuroticism was not associated with odds of developing any of the chronic conditions. So I think this one, it's for all the chronic conditions. So like horizontally, like one is for the top is hypertension, the middle is diabetes, and the bottom is heart disease. So we basically found no effect. It was also not effect with the risk of mortality. We did find effects for healthy N being associated with lower risk of smoking, heavy drinking, and higher odds of engaging in physical activity. So we found that it was related basically to the A pathway, but for nothing else. Fortunately, we published these in Collaborative Psychology, which is very open to open science practices. So they're all about publishing null results. So we got all 3 of these papers published, which is great for reducing publication bias and file drawer effects, which is part of our goal in this, is because we didn't know what we didn't know about how many null interactions had been found on individual people's laptops as they were analyzing their data. So this kind of gives a more comprehensive story about what the state of healthy neuroticism is. And the part that bums me out about this is that of the 3 papers, the one with the highest citation count is the one that had the significant effects. So for all of our best intentions, it's still, people don't really cite the null effect because that's not what they want to hear. And the other sad part is that nobody really talks about healthy neuroticism anymore. We kind of killed it. But I would like to say that it still has great face validity. I still love the concept of it, and it still might be a thing. We only used one operational definition of healthy neuroticism, so there could be other conceptualizations that we could kind of go down this road and see if it's a thing, but I haven't moved forward with that. If anybody else wants to take up that mantle, they're welcome to. Okay, so now I've given you a glimmer into how we did a coordinated analysis. All of our other projects were not done using this workshop method. I just like talking about it because it was really fun. And it was a really cool way to teach people how to do it. It was an opportunity to network with other ECRs, teach people how to do this method. And I think every single person that was in that room, I still collaborate with. And it has spawned many cool research ideas and projects. So if you're interested in doing something like this, please come talk to me. This is kind of what I do. So the two key, so I'm giving you a glimmer of this because we were already talking about healthy neuroticism. But the two key sets of psychosocial factors that I focus on are big five personality traits on the one hand, and on the other hand, the experience of loneliness and social isolation. So on the one hand, the big five personality trait taxon, I'm basically going to give you like a semester-long course in these two areas in about 90 seconds. So buckle up. Big five personality trait taxonomy is one commonly used tool for capturing an individual's typical pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. That's literally the definition of personality that we use. Personality traits have previously been linked to a number of health behaviors and health outcomes, including cognitive health. And then secondly, I focus on in my work is the experience of loneliness and social isolation. So isolation is the characterization of the objective experience of social contact. So how often you are in contact with other people, how frequently. While loneliness is the more subjective, psychological, emotional experience, tapping into the disconnect between how connected you are and how connected you wish you were. So in brief, a lot of people are lonely. This problem is particularly prevalent among older adults as social networks wane, social opportunities become more sparse, and social isolation increases in older adulthood. Both loneliness and social isolation have been linked to consequential health outcomes such as functional impairment, cardiovascular disease, and mortality. And even earlier this year, the Surgeon General put out an advisory on what they're calling the epidemic of loneliness and social isolation. So this is a large and growing problem, especially among older adults, and the rapidly growing body of evidence that lonely adults may be particularly vulnerable to a number of negative health outcomes, including cognitive senescence. And I know that you guys had Julia come give a big talk last year about it, which was awesome. I was on there via Zoom. So that's like my 10-second version of basically her entire talk. And Anthony and I recently received funding, 5 years of funding to study this. So it's a very exciting new line of research for us. So the question is, how might these two factors get under the skin to impact health in later life? So one framework suggests that individuals with higher levels of certain personality traits, or those who experience high and persistent loneliness or possibly increasing loneliness, may be exposed to more stressors and might have higher reactivity to those. So chronic activation of the HPA axis, low-grade inflammatory activity can lead to health problems down the road. So for example, a recent meta-analysis put out by our team found that personality traits, especially neuroticism, are related to higher allostatic load in older adulthood. And I'll point out that that finding is actually a traditional meta-analysis. It was a systematic review, meta-analysis of the existing literature, not what I'm calling a classic CDA. So the second framework is that of the health behavior model. And that's pretty much what I've been couching everything we've talked about up to this point. So this suggests that psychological factors predict health, and these associations are likely mediated by lifestyle factors, such as like individuals with higher or lower levels of certain traits, or who are less lonely or more lonely, might be more or less likely to engage in a compounding lifetime of behaviors that serve as either risk or protective factors for these downstream late life outcomes. You like how in one sentence I did both directionalities. So it's a mouthful to keep straight, but off we go. So much of what I'm going to show you in the next few minutes is all ongoing. And I'm also only going to show you a snapshot of the findings from each project. So every single CDA, what you see on a slide is like the tip of an iceberg and represents probably hundreds of pages of supplemental online material or my recently discovered Shiny apps, which if you don't know how to do those are super cool. I don't know how to do them, but our postdocs do. So for every CDA, we have a Shiny app and people can go onto clicks through all the different moderators and what have you. So it's very cool. So the figure that you're looking at here, I kind of, in the healthy neuroticism slide, I kind of walked you through like how we designed the project. We identified the problem, like isolated a research question, came up with a list of inclusion criteria, identified data sets. So for each of these, we went through that same process. But I won't walk you through it every single time. So for this particular project, we were examining the extent to which traits were associated with risky health behaviors, including binge drinking and risky sexual behavior, which is another cool little add-on to this. So one of our former postdocs, Olivia Atherton, has been figuring out how to do Medicare linkage with these large longitudinal data sets. Do not recommend it. It is a horribly tedious process, but very cool if we can get it, because most panel studies don't ask older adults if they're engaging in risky sexual behavior, because, you know, survey research methodology and demand characters. So it's like, they're not going to tell the truth, or the study's not asking about it correctly. But if you have Medicare records, you can see whether or not they were tested for STIs, which is an indication of whether or not the doctor thinks they are engaging in these. So if we could get the right Medicare linkage set up, we will actually have those results to present. But as of yet, we are getting really hung up with the DOA process. So that's good fun. But anyways, back to what you're looking at here. The forest plot you're looking at here is showing the extent to which conscientiousness was associated with lower odds of engaging in binge drinking behavior. So this was across 8 data sets. So we tested these models independently using, again, identical data transformation. These were all logistic regression models. And as is the case with all CDAs, you'll see that there is a variability in these effects. But 5 of the 8 studies show a significant protective effect. So on the left side of that middle line. And this highlights to me one of the benefits of coordinated analysis. So those non-significant effects, if this had been done as a single study project, those effects would either never have been published and contributed to the file drawer, but here they're included and they're now in the record of published effects. So this reduces biases for future meta-analysis. So we have a more comprehensive picture of what's really going on in all of these individual data sets. So second, and also exploring pathways between, yes, we did switch slides, personality and health behaviors is a project that we did looking at whether Big 5 traits are associated with various forms of healthcare utilization. And for this project, we identified 11 independent samples that could address that question. So in addition to testing the full Big 5, we also included primary care use, hospitalizations, and emergency department use as outcomes. So these findings provide evidence for that personality is associated with both preventive healthcare use and with reactive healthcare use. And this just shows, again, just one of these results suggesting that higher neuroticism is associated with lower odds of going to the dentist regularly. And as I was going through and updating these slides for today, I forgot to update that this one is actually in press at JPSB right now. So it got accepted finally. It's not under review anymore. To widen our lens a little bit more, that neuroticism is in general associated with maladaptive health behaviors. The effect here is relatively small. So you see the confidence bands around each individual study estimates are pretty wide. But adds credence to the idea that when we do need to look at these sorts of effects within the context of other studies. So a one-off study, kind of like I said just a moment ago, might lead us to believe that, yes, neuroticism is definitely associated with dental care use, if we're just using the SAPA data, for example. Or definitely no, it's not, if we were just publishing using the MIDAS data. And then we would need to wait however many years it took for some researcher, for some young upstart like yourselves, to do a systematic review and a traditional meta-analysis to then reach this conclusion. But we were able to do it. I mean, these projects don't happen overnight. It took probably 2 years to get this done. But still, we get the answers much more quickly than we would have otherwise. Okay, so now we can move on to the next slide. Let's talk about health outcomes. So this project was looking at both prospective and concurrent associations between personality traits and several health outcomes, including self-rated health, general disease level, and cognitive function. So this was a coordinated analysis of just 3 data sets. And the results here I'm showing is just from one of these studies. So I think this one was the health and retirement study, the HRS. So essentially this project was done by one of our former postdocs, Jing Luo, who's now on the faculty in our department. And she does wickedly complicated models that always have really heavy data requirements. So she ultimately only ends up using a few studies in her coordinated analysis, but they have really powerful models that they're really cool. So we basically found that neuroticism is consistently associated with poor self-rated health across the full lifespan. That conscientiousness is not associated with general disease level in earlier life, but this association becomes stronger. So the line is kind of trending downwards towards older adulthood, suggesting that in older adulthood, those who are higher in conscientiousness have lower disease levels. So it seems to have this salubrious effect, particularly among OAs. And that openness is associated with better cognitive function in earlier life, not associated in midlife, and then protective again in old age. So put together with the other samples of this paper, it paints a picture suggesting that the associations among personality traits and health may vary across the lifespan, which is important information to know as we set to unpack how these longitudinal pathways all fit together. So now we have to talk about the ultimate health outcome, mortality. I feel like my Grim Reaper. So this was actually our very first CDA, but I talk about it out of order because since it's mortality. This looked at whether big five traits were associated with mortality via smoking behavior using that full mediation survival model. So I tested this model in 15 studies and found that a number of traits were directly associated with risk of mortality. So this one here is just the forest plot showing the association for conscientiousness. And we see an overall protective pattern that's pretty consistent across data sets. We also found pretty consistent evidence for neuroticism being associated with higher risk of mortality. And for the other traits, it was a little more mixed. I think it was overall a null effect for openness. And now I don't have it off the top of my head. And I think for extroversion, this is a good like meta regression lesson. So we did the effect for extroversion. I think we found a really small protective effect, but it was really, when you spread it across the European versus US studies, you found a real disconnect. So like at the study level, we actually found that country moderated that effect, which means that maybe the way that extroversion is being measured or valued in Europe is different than in the US. So that's an interesting little nugget that goes along with this project. So we also found that smoking did not mediate the association between any of the big five traits of mortality. And the forest plot that just popped up here is not what's showing that. This actually is just showing the effect of smoking on mortality. So we found very tidy evidence, very consistently replicated in case anyone wasn't yet convinced that smoking is bad for your health. As illustrated in the panel to your right, I guess it's to your right, in nearly all studies, smoking was associated with higher risk of mortality. And the only one, I think the one that we see the biggest spread is for LBLS, which is the Long Beach longitudinal study. And I think that in Long Beach, California, there's not many people that were smoking. So I don't really trust that result. But anyways, this is a pretty strong overall effect. If this was 1950s, big tobacco would not want me to publish this result, but I like to show it. It's not one of the key findings of this paper, but I like to show it. It's just like a really cleanly replicated result. So jumping back to that mediation piece, given that this was our first CDA, one thing we learned that is within the context of coordinated analysis, it's actually really hard to do a mediation model. So before jumping into like the big full mediation, it's important to take a step back and look at these individual pathways, which is why a lot of what you're seeing from me now is looking at the psychosocial factors and health behaviors, or one health outcome, not the full mediation. Because trying to coordinate that across many data sets is a bear, and it was fun. So we're focusing on answering the simple foundational questions first, and then our future work will continue moving towards replicating those more complex causal models later. So you might be asking yourself, as we've looked at these effects, doesn't personality change as people know? Might personality dynamics in personality predict health as well? Well, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. One assumption we can't always make is that personality remains stable across the lifespan. And this has been one of these questions that have kept personality psychologists up at night. It's like, does it change? And for a long time, like Costa and McRae's of the world, like, oh no, it's stable. If it's not stable, it's not personality. And then we realized, oh, it might change. And then the data sets got on board and realized that if we really want to reliably measure change in personality, turns out you need not just baseline personality data. We need more than 2 measurement occasions. So in recent years, these big longitudinal panel studies, I feel like we've been like dragging them into the modern world. They keep measuring personality, and now we're able to reliably model using more sophisticated analytic techniques the extent to which personality changes and how much individual differences there are. So here, just a quick little, if you've ever heard of Paul Baltus, here he is. This all is being underlying with the Paul Baltus theory of lifespan development and individual differences. Maybe change continues throughout the lifespan due to social investment or the maturity principle, those things that come with middle age. And then the question of, do we continue to change in older adulthood? And does that in turn impact our health? And that's what I'm really interested in. So the first thing I set out to do in this area was to replicate evidence for just patterns of change in Big Five across the adult lifespan. So this coordinated analysis used identical multi-level models for change across 16 independent samples. And this, in each data set, we allowed the age range to vary, which is why you see those lines start in different places. So that was the youngest age of any given study. And then the black line is the meta-analytic average. So even across differences in the tool used to measure the Big Five, the total follow-up time, the spacing between measurement occasions, all of that was allowed to vary, like what your baseline was, what country we were studying. That was all taken into account at the meta-analytic level. And we found pretty compelling evidence for personality change. This is just for neuroticism. Again, you can look at the paper for all of the Big Five changes, and then, you know, hundreds and hundreds of pages of supplemental online material for everything else. But basically what we see is that we found evidence suggesting that neuroticism may decline through middle adulthood and increases again in older adulthood. We also found substantial evidence for individual differences in these changes. So the next step is to then go in and predict among whom those changes are occurring most consistently. And we also have some ongoing work looking at age period and cohort effects, in case you're wondering, because that's important too. So now we have a decent foundation of across all these studies that have this information, the extent of personality change, but then is it related to anything we care about? So a recent, I'm gonna away the farm here. This is a recent paper of ours that came out, again, was led by Jing Luo, who's research faculty in our department. Again, it was a relatively small CDA because she does these really powerful models. This was using the random intercept cross-like panel model, or RICKLE-PIM, as I like to call them. The data requirements for these models are incredibly heavy. So the number of studies meeting the inclusion criteria was pretty low. So this, I believe, was only using 3. And we found that, among other things, that changes in neuroticism were associated with both level and change in several health outcomes, including self-rated health, disease level, cardiovascular disease, and central nervous system dysfunction. And these findings were consistent with the idea that increasing in positive traits and decreasing in negative traits is typically generally good for health. And further suggests that personality could be used to predict onset and progression of disease, or be maybe an early warning sign for, this is where I get into like the medical model, because I work at a med school and they want to know implementation science, how are we applying this? So this is kind of one of those glimmers of how personality could be used to help identify people who are more at risk, more vulnerable, or possibly more resilient. So then, of course, I have to wrap up this section with a question of whether personalities change is associated with mortality. My team and I, led by Emily Wilroth, who's now on faculty at WashU, we found that basically no, personality change isn't related to mortality. But that's not the end of this story. And I believe this paper is either under review or just recently, I think it's under revision now at JPSP. And it's another tough lesson in why CDA is so difficult, and so it's hard for complex models. So most, with the exception of the personality and mortality mediation paper, most of what I've been presenting up to this point is relatively straightforward models. We're doing basic linear regression, maybe logistic regression, or even with the growth models, they're still fairly straightforward multi-level growth models. But for this, and we also use relatively few covariates. So we use the bare minimum. We try to be intentional with like potential collider bias and all of that, and as few parameter constraints as we can. So adding random effect terms, we only use the ones that we have like absolutely theoretical principled reason to add. So this project used growth survival models. So the data set to be included needed to have at least 3 measurement occasions of the predictor, so personality, so we could model growth. And then also we needed enough time for enough people to die so then we could reliably model mortality at the same time. So we ended up fighting with some unstable estimates. It was a bit of an uphill battle, but these are results that we can trust, but also with a grain of salt, we know that we need more data. We need more time to pass and more data to be collected before basically internally replicating these again to see if these results hold up, if these are really null effects, or if there's actually something to be said. And we've had some really interesting conversations with the reviewers and the editors about this because they want to publish it, but it's like, So again, maybe CDAs for complex models is a bit of a headache. So keep it simple, basic, foundational. Okay, so now I'm going to jump over to loneliness with the time we have left. Is everybody still with me? So I've started to use the coordinated analysis approach to address similar questions about loneliness in older adulthood. This figure might look very similar to one that you've seen before because you can, use similar code and swap out your y-axis. So using similar code, we applied it to questions of loneliness. Again, identified data sets that had multiple measurement occasions so we can model the trajectory of loneliness across time. And there is a decent literature on loneliness at this point, but of course I want to replicate stuff. So I got my grubby hands in there and here we go. So we sought out first to plot out trajectories of loneliness over time. And this was the first project that Anthony and I started doing in the spring of 2020, ironically. And we found that across the 8 studies that met our minimum inclusion criteria, that people do overall increase in loneliness. So it appears to dip in midlife. So we found this significant quadratic effect. And it could be explained, this could be potentially explained by things like social investment theory. So like middle-aged people don't have time to be lonely. We're too busy. And then as, our responsibilities begin waning in older adulthood, maybe that begins to tick back up. This paper also included a number of key predictors to see who's at greater risk of being and becoming more lonely. And it turns out the people who tended to be persistently lonely, so not changing, just persist at the intercept level across all measurement occasions. These people were women, they were unmarried, less educated, more objectively isolated, and had poorer health. But those same factors did not consistently predict change in loneliness, suggesting that these psychological factors or sociodemographic factors are more closely related to being and remaining high in loneliness and not necessarily with that growth. So this currently is under revision at Psych Science. I'm proud of that. Hopefully we'll get that in here back under review in the next few weeks. So then one of the next steps we'll be doing is examining whether the observed increases or changes in loneliness predict downstream health and mortality. So stay tuned. Yes. Is my loneliness killing me? We dubbed this the Britney Spears project. It is currently or almost under review as a registered report at JPSB, and we've been working really closely with the editor there to get it into shape for a credible secondary analysis. And these are going to be really complicated models, so we're ready to have some fun. It's going to be cool. Hopefully we'll be able to present that soon, maybe next year. Am I doing all right on time, Anthony? Okay. All right, so now where are we? Oh, my last area. What I really love talking about is cognitive aging. Where am I? In brief, recent years have turned to a focus of prevention of Alzheimer's and related dementia. We know that Alzheimer's and related dementias, ADRD, is a massively burdensome, both at the individual and system level. Again, can you tell I work at a med school? I'm like, we have to talk about system level burden. Drug trials have been fairly limited, but there's some recent ones that may be promising. So my work here is aimed at, instead of treatment or mitigation or treatment, we're looking at helping understand how we might work to prevent the onset. So I want to understand who is most vulnerable or resilient to cognitive senescence, who's able to tolerate neuropathic burden, who's resilient to the accumulation of analytic tangles, et cetera, and who's able to live relatively free of cognitive impairment for long as possible throughout the lifespan. So that's what we call the cognitive health span. So constraining, or the compression of morbidity, constraining the number of years in which somebody is cognitively impaired to the shortest amount of time prior to their death. So one key line of inquiry here has focused on cognitive resilience. So for me, this construct taps into an idea that keeps me up at night, not really, but it has motivated me to pursue my career path in the first place. Yes, really. So I took a class as an undergrad called Cognitive Aging, and I talked about the nun study, which was led by David Snowden down in Kentucky, I think, where he found that these nuns, some of them were like super intact, and then they autopsied their brains and had like complete neurodegeneration, like brains well under 1,000 grams. And then some who were completely very impaired throughout their lives, but then had completely intact brains. And it's the question of like, why is there this discordance happening? And I just like put a light bulb on for me. And now here I am. So we haven't quite solved it, but we're pursuing it. So yes, how is it that some people can experience massive neurodegeneration and accumulation of neuropathology in their brains and yet remain relatively free of impairment? And conversely, why do some people experience massive declines and substantial impairment and yet at autopsy are relatively intact? So for these projects, we teamed up with the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center because of our work with the Healthy Neuroticism Project. That created some really cool network, like professional connections that we're now working with them formally. And their study designs are very cool because at consent, their participants agree to autopsy upon their death. So for every participant, with the exception of the minority aging research study, the MARS, they have the option to decline consenting to autopsy, mostly because those are Black Americans, and the ethics around getting Black Americans to participate in studies is very carefully handled, considering all of the ethical problems that have occurred in the past. So they're handling that very carefully. But even still, most MARS participants do consent to it. So anyways, they upon their death, they have their brains and their spinal cords autopsied. So we get data on their amyloid plaques, their tau tangles, TDP43, and all these other neuropathological indicators that are indicative of, that are predictors of Alzheimer's disease. So this work that we've done is uses the neuropath data is very unique. So these studies actually aren't coordinated analyses, but they will be. So we computed cognitive resilience using the residuals approach. So essentially we regressed their annual cognition data. So they collect these cognitive batteries every year onto all of the neuropath indicators, and then we extracted the residual. So in other words, we know that neuropathology is a huge predictor of cognitive function, decline, and dementia. So by doing this approach, we're accounting for all of the variance in cognition that neuropathology can account for, and that residual variance serves as an indicator of how much better or worse a person's cognition is than expected, given how much neuropathology they have. That's a mouthful, but basically it's creating a single index that's an estimate of how resilient or vulnerable they are to neuropathology. So that residual has served as our outcome. And higher scores indicate that someone with better cognition has better cognition than expected given their neuropathologic burden, and vice versa. Lower scores indicate that somebody had worse function than expected or lower resilience. So since this analytic approach requires that the data set has autopsy data, not many longitudinal studies do this, obviously. So we just have Rush Alzheimer's studies. So it's 3 data sets. So I guess technically it is an IDA, but since the designs are pretty much identical across all 3 studies, it's just different study populations. These are basically pooled analyses at this point. So they're naturally harmonized because it's all the same measures that are being used. So we've put out 3 papers now using this cognitive resilience index. We basically find that first, higher neuroticism and lower conscientiousness are related to lower resilience. that lower psychological well-being is related to lower resilience, and that both high and increasing loneliness is related to lower resilience. So importantly, these findings for loneliness were robust to the inclusion of social isolation. So we had isolation as a covariate in these models, and isolation was not a predictor. Loneliness was. So this suggests that the emotional experience of loneliness may be uniquely important for cognitive health. And then moving forward, we're going to team up with a few other RADCs from around the country that also have psychosocial and autopsy data. That's another problem, like the Northwestern ADRC doesn't collect personality data, in which we are deeply disappointed, but what can you do? And we're also using the new diagnostic criteria that was just put out by the AAIC at the conference over the summer, in which there's now more in vivo markers that are being used as diagnostic criteria. So we're kind of going to redo these projects using those in vivo markers, which will be able to include more data sets and do a proper coordinated analysis on this. So it's very exciting for me. So then this last project I'm going to show you, I'm going to go back to like proper coordinated analysis. It's taking another step back into those more computationally simple models in order to show, again, some basic foundational replication of the simple associations between personality traits, well-being indicators, and dementia risk and neuropathology. So in other words, we know that we wanted to know across many data sets whether these psychosocial factors are just directly related to the simple odds of being diagnosed with dementia, and whether these factors were also related to neuropathology. So we identified 8 data sets with the requisite data and a small subset that also had postmortem neuropath, which was basically just the Rush studies. And then also we identified the WashU ADRC also had neuropath and personality. So we got 8 data sets. And the goal was just to address of how robust are the associations between psychological factors and dementia. And how well do these replicate? So for some of these results, it was beautifully crystal clear. So for the first key question we found, I didn't highlight it. Oops. So the forest plot here shows the sample specific estimates plus the meta-analytic average of the associations between big 5 traits for the top down to openness. And then we also had some well-being indicators because this was kind of a lab-wide project with a couple different areas of inquiry. So we see that for the big 5, particularly for conscientious and neuroticism. So those are for the second 2 panels from the top. We found for these 2 traits that every single study found a fairly strong effect, indicating that individuals higher in neuroticism are more likely to receive a dementia diagnosis over the course of the study, and that individuals higher in conscientiousness are less likely to receive a dementia diagnosis over the course of the study. So this is pretty exciting to us. So we did this in a number of different ways, but one thing I want to point out is that dementia diagnosis was defined differently in all of these studies. So for some of them, they did a formal neuropsychological evaluation. So this is like actually a formal diagnosis of dementia. And for some of them, they're self-report, which a lot of criticism has been received in the field. Like you can't reliably ask somebody if they have dementia or have ever been diagnosed with dementia because like, who knows? But we found that regardless of how it was assessed in a given study, we still found personality consistently predicting it. So it's evidence that like across measurement tools, we're still replicating this effect, which to me is the coolest part of this. And we're also really proud that this just got accepted into the Journal of Alzheimer's and Dementia, which is really, really exciting for us. Many rounds of review, a lot of criticism and questions about the CDA approach, but all in all, they were into it. So I'm really, really excited to see this one actually come out in print very soon. So then the next step for this basic finding will be to dig into the possible underlying mechanisms for this using those 3 theoretical frameworks I was touching on in the beginning. So exploring the extent to which health behaviors, cardiometabolic and inflammatory risk markers, also sociodemographic moderators of like for whom and at what point in their lives are like, is this actually most salient? And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over what I was going to say there. So in conclusion, coordinated data analysis is a very useful tool for replicating findings in long-term longitudinal studies of aging. We find that big five personality traits and loneliness both change consistently over time across studies, and these may be related to health behaviors and consequential health outcomes in later adulthood. And similarly for loneliness, we are also starting to find similar effects. We found that these factors are related to cognitive resilience, cognitive senescence, and we're kind of moving forward looking at the extent to which these are related to the cognitive health span, and that these factors are also related to lower risk of dementia. So in the future, we're continuing to do CDA work to answer these key foundational questions. We're going to keep looking at psychological factors and related to those in vivo biomarkers of Alzheimer's and of neuropathology to see if we can replicate these before we have to wait for people to die, essentially. And then build our growing knowledge of loneliness and social isolation using multi-state models to see if loneliness and social isolation predict the transition from normal cognition into mild cognitive impairment, dementia, and into death. And it accounts for competing risk factors. They're very complicated models. We're doing it as a CDA. If you want to hear more, that's the Britney Spears project. And then we're going to be doing some age period cohort analysis to see if historical period, place and time really has an effect, the historical effects on all of these. So I'm working with Olivia Atherton to do some work on that. And that is all. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Felix. Any questions?
I'm pointing on Zoom too, so if anyone in the room wants to start, or I can be able to ask this person to.
No, I can't see the. Oh, I have a Hamilton reference. So I'm never satisfied. I always have to do a CDA of something. Anyways. I can't see the chat anymore because we hit it and I'm going to get it back.
Might be if you hover up
at the top.
I'm happy to reiterate my question aloud if you guys can hear me.
Sure.
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much. This was really an excellent talk. I've been getting really interested in getting into some coordinated data analysis. But one of the things I was wondering as I was kind of skimming the literature is why you might decide to do a coordinated data analysis. If, for example, you could do an integrated data analysis, are there any advantages to assessing your effects separately if you could harmonize your measures perfectly?
So one reason I have no hard feelings towards pooled analysis. I'm not a psychometrician, so that's part of why I don't do it, because it's hard. But also, and importantly, coordinated analysis does not require data sets to be in one physical location. So it makes it easier to include data sets that exist in places with really, really heavy data use agreement requirements. For example, a lot of the studies collected in the European Union are not allowed to cross international boundaries. So if we wanted to use those data sets, we couldn't really do the true harmonization that we would want to. So in the spirit of inclusion, we want to be able to basically come up with a common set of scripts and like transformation schemes that we then send to analysts. So I work with collaborators all over the world and I send them scripts, they clean their data and then they send me the outputs and then I synthesize it all. So in one hand, it actually makes my job harder because then I have to coordinate, oh, there's a code error. Oh, the reviewer said we need to add this covariate, do this thing, and then you have to send out new scripts to everyone and trying to set up a meeting with the Australians to debug their code means that somebody's working at midnight and somebody, so it has its own challenges, but I like the fact that it allows for inclusion of data sets that might not otherwise be able to be included. And I think paints a more comprehensive picture. At least that's just the way I see it. But I think that doing pooled analysis is a great way to approach it. Oh, and we have a paper coming out that is not yet in press, but is perpetually almost, or not in press, under review. It's almost under review. We all have those papers that are like so close to submitting, but we haven't quite done it yet. That has basically taken one really basic research question, and I'm forgetting what it is off the top of my head. I think it's a personality and cognition question. And it's basically asking a meta question. Do we get the same answer to this modeling approach if we do every different version of IDA that we can think of? So coordinated analysis, both with and without a meta-analytics summary, pooled analysis with and without various random effects parameterizations in the pooled analysis. And we essentially find that we draw the same conclusion no matter what IDA approach we used. So our conclusion in that paper is that as individual researchers, as you're deciding what approach to IDA you want, the important thing is to consider what makes sense for the question you're asking, what data sets are available. Like if all of the data sets that meet your inclusion criteria are publicly available, then by all means do a pooled analysis. Like almost even do with whatever's easier for you. Like if you don't have the psychometric skills, then you don't need to. You're going to get the same answer more or less anyways. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that is an excellent answer. That's really super helpful. I hadn't thought about some of the data restrictions, and I had run into a couple data sets where I realized that could be an issue, and I didn't realize you could send scripts and basically ask people.
Yeah, it's a really exciting way to do it.
Yeah,
So
that's
thank
so
you
cool.
for asking that.
Thank you. Yeah.
And hopefully that paper will be out eventually. We'll get it
Yes,
there.
I will keep an eye out for it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good question. I just kind of like a big picture about doing, I guess this is kind of a question about meta-analysis and integrated data analysis in general, but when you do something like that, I feel like you have to run the risk of ruffling feathers because you're kind of not claiming ostensibly, but you're kind of claiming you're finding the answer for a big question in a way. I was kind of curious like how you navigate that maybe in like a informally from a research perspective, bigger research perspective.
Disarm them with my charm.
Yeah,
No, but really, I have thought of that because we, like, for example, when we were doing the Healthy Neuroticism project, we reached out to Howard Friedman when we first started the project, and he was super into it. And then when we found no results, he was less into it, but he was still supportive. And we were like, we are not trying to say that this isn't a thing, but here's what we found. And it goes back to that, go all the way back. Like if you're thinking of, if you're thinking of like the big PIs who are like, they have these legacy research areas, like we do not want to step on those toes, but also we're not here to just continue confirming a result that you think should be there. Like we want to answer the question for real to the best that we know how. And I will always approach that with humility. Like it's always subject to human error. We could be wrong, but if we find that same effect across this many data sets, like maybe we're not wrong. Or if we didn't find the effect, maybe you were wrong. Like, isn't science supposed to be falsifiable? And that's kind of what we're out here to do, but I try to do it as humbly as possible. It's a great question. And I'm pretty sure I've ruffled some feathers, and there's probably people who don't like me, but I just have to get my armor on and accept it. Yes.
I think to just follow up with James's question is, it does seem like there's a real risk in when you do the coordinated analysis, if you don't handle the causal questions in there, you're going to propagate that issue through all the studies that you do. So you do that analysis over 10 studies. If you didn't handle confounding appropriately in all of them, you run this risk of, putting out an association, which could be biased.
It could be biased. That's absolutely right. And we have, when it comes to causal modeling, the actual approaches that are being used right now, I am not an expert in, so I'm not going to claim to be, but my understanding is that it would be really difficult to do coordinated analyses using those approaches, but I am open to them. But then with respect to your question about like putting out a set of biased results given not appropriately accounting for confounders, I think that is a great question. And the little bit of you do the best you know how, and then as you know better, you do better. And as we've moved forward over the past decade into our second decade of doing this work, we're becoming more principled and intentional about how and when we're selecting covariates to reduce those risks as much as possible, while also putting forth results that account, like almost like in a multiverse analysis sort of way, like with like intentional sets of covariates. Here's an unadjusted model, here's a partially adjusted model, here's a fully adjusted model. My work with Emery Beck has also looked at like, if you do every possible combination of covariates, what happens? And that's really more her line of research to kind of reduce that. So like when you see this effect, here's how it holds up when you adjust in all these different ways. And that's why our supplemental material get to be so ridiculously huge, because we don't want to put forth biased effects, especially like replicated biased effects, because like some would say that's almost worse, but we're doing our best to address that. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a great question.
Seeing more on Zoom right now.
Ask a question. I'm thinking about the sort of like clinical implications of the findings with personality, like conscientiousness in general is good and neuroticism is bad. And maybe that's because they contribute to different health behaviors that then contribute to different health outcomes. And so I guess I have two questions. One is like, what do we know about like openness and agreeable? Like, do those other dimensions matter? And the other question is just, it's encouraging that personality is malleable, because maybe you can change your personality and then change those behaviors and change the health outcomes. But I guess I'm wondering, like, from an intervention perspective, where would you suggest, like, is it better to try to like change the person's personality and then that changes their behavior and they have better outcomes, or do you just go and try to fix the behavior?
I think that's a great question. It's very like implementation sciencey. I think that this work could help inform what we're starting to call like personality-based precision medicine, where we know that personality can change, but enacting an intervention study where we try to create permanent, long-lasting personality change with the end goal of influencing a behavior that's going to influence your health is probably more of an uphill battle than changing the behavior. But I think personality is really useful in this respect, because what we kind of envision is like in the future at your annual wellness visit, if the doctor or your physician knows, you know, they have your like a personality profile on you, they know that like you're really high in neuroticism, you might be at greater risk of engaging in these behaviors. So I'm going to keep an eye on these things a little bit more than somebody who's lower. And so that's kind of where I see it coming in place, is like kind of being implemented into the healthcare system in that way, so they can identify people who are more or less at risk to help like kind of steer them in the right direction. That's a great question. And I love your question about openness, extroversion, and agreeableness, because like I love openness. I love them all. Like I have a personality researcher. I'm like, oh, I love each trait, but we don't find consistent effects. Like these CDAs have found like some, like it's a smaller effect. It's not as consistent. And we haven't really known what to make of it, except in a couple examples, like in the personality and mortality project, where we found that the effect of extroversion was dependent on whether it was a US or European study. And then we also found that it was in the trajectories project, where we found all the growth curves of the big five, that the effect of agreeableness was all over the place. Like there was no consistency across studies. The meta-analytic effect was null, which was really, it was like a masking of like the studies that found a positive, the studies that found a negative, and it was all just averaged into a nothing effect. but when we started looking at like the meta-analytic moderators, like it gets a little bit squirrely because, you know, we're looking at, you know, at that point, it was only like 9 studies that had it. So like, you can't really draw well-powered conclusions at that point. But it looks like the different studies, and of course this varies across continents, but there are only so many ways you can ask somebody how anxious they are. So neuroticism measurements tend to be relatively consistent from a measurement standpoint. And agreeableness is all over the place. And there are cultural differences in what it means to be agreeable. And one of our former postdocs, Tico, who's now a professor at UC Davis, she dug in there to the translations across, I think it was the SHARE study, which is across like 27 different European countries. And depending on the country, the interpretation of agreeableness is sometimes like, you know, a very pleasant person versus a hostile person. And in some countries, it means you're gullible. And so the meaning of agreeableness, so like that, like it really comes down to like a measurement difference for that. So I claim no confident conclusions about like change in agreeableness because the measurements were so different. Yes.
I have a related question, which is effectively like, while I understand like a lot of the practical reasons to kind of take a like psychometrics free kind of coordinated analysis approach.
Yep.
To what extent do you like worry about differences in null or non-null effects or like directions or magnitudes of things being impacted by measurement non-invariance? Like if people in different countries or studies are answering, say, like personality items just very differently, we're not measuring the same thing.
That's a great question.
You know, what do you do? It like, because I think that's something where I start to wonder, like, is it fair to use like a Z-score? I have the same kind of like question about, you know, traditional meta-analysis, where you put it all on a Cohen, like a Hedges G, and don't worry about it.
Well, it's not that we are not worried about it. That's like, it's an open question. That, I mean, I think the best answer I can give you is that like, I think that's an avenue worth pursuing. Like we see, like when we see consistency in spite of all those differences, that's one thing. But when we see inconsistency, it could be explained by measurement invariance or other such issues, which I think is a worthwhile avenue to go down if you were ever interested in doing that. I'm definitely open to it. So it's a good question. Yes, Anthony.
I'm gonna ask the weird question.
What's that?
I'm gonna ask the weird question. Which is,
And by the way, it's 20 after, so if anybody needs to go.
yeah, I'll be quick. Which is like, how many of these CDAs have included like non-Western samples?
That's not a weird, oh, it's a weird question. Thank you. I was like, that's not weird. Oh, yes, it is. I see what I did there.
I mean, in the context of personality, actually, I'm thinking of the work of Shinobi Kiriyama. So he finds like conscientious, for example, is you know, positively associated with mental health in both Japanese and US samples, but actually when it comes to physical health, he doesn't find that, right? It's actually worse to be high conscientiousness if you're Japanese in terms of things like your inflammation relative to US. And so I'm just wondering, you know,
I love that question, and it constantly plagues us because so many of these large longitudinal panel studies that we use are from Western developed countries. So to really drill down into like how these effects would play out in non-weird samples, like even using the MIDJA, we don't quite have, they don't like, for some we've been able to include them, but for a lot of our work, like they just don't have the data that we need. So I think that's a great question. And I know you and I have talked about this, but I think that is another avenue of pursuit that is definitely worthwhile to see how and when these effects replicate in other truly other cultures, not just like US versus Europe. It's like they're different, but So great question. Thank you.
Had some more plaudits from the Zoom crowd too, just saying how wonderful the talk was. Just saying.
Thank you very much. Love it.